Folks, welcome to the Bradley J. Show. Once again, this is kind of the second broadcast of today. This episode is brought to you by Rick Walker's. Rick Walker's rock and roll cowboy clothes since 1932. New and vintage rock t-shirts, jewelry, leather jackets, including Vanson leathers. And they're at 306 Newbury Street, Back Bay in Boston. We're with Rich Rubino, who is a genius, actually, like a strangely encyclopedic knowledge of everything political. It's wild, as you'll see. He's the author of 5 books. I'll run through them briefly, and we'll talk about them in a little bit. And then I'll say hi to Rick. The Great American Political Trivia Challenge, The Political Bible, Make Every Vote Equal, and American Politics on the Rocks, and The Political Bible, Humorous Quotations from American Politics. So my description of those were very cursory and not very good. He'll go through it later. But it's been a long time since I've spoken about political stuff, and I'm glad to have you here to do it with. I have many questions, sir. Are you ready? By the way, hi, Rick.
Ready.
Hi, Rich.
I am ready.
Thank you for being on. Can you
You're
tell
welcome.
folks a little bit about you before we get into this?
Sure. Well, I'm a political author going back around 2011. I was looking for a book specifically about something other than just strictly presidential trivia. So it kind of put the ideation in my head to write a book that was kind of about interesting things in American politics. So I wrote the Political Bible of Little Known Facts in American Politics. I did a book tour, and subsequently on that book tour, I was asked ad nauseum about some of the political quotations in American history. So that gave me the impetus to write my second book, which was called The Political Bible of Humorous Quotations in American Politics. Basically funny things that politicians have said, but putting into context. Then I was working on I wrote another book that was kind of off the reservation a little bit about the Electoral College. And I came back and wrote the American Politics on the Rocks, which is essentially just kind of interesting things in American politics with pictures. And then everyone just kept asking me, they kept saying, you should be on Jeopardy doing something to do with political trivia. And I said, no, first of all, I think that's such a niche market, political trivia. And I wouldn't necessarily know about other things, but also if I were to write some sort of a book about political trivia, I wouldn't want it just to be question answer, who's the 23rd president, who's the 23rd, that type of thing. I wanted to put some actual detail in it. So I wrote I wrote a book about political trivia. It's called the Great American Political Trivia Challenge, political trivia on steroids, about 500 pages of political trivia, a lot of it humorous, some of it interesting, everything from the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union to contemporaneous times. And I do a lot of analysis as well on radio. And that's kind of my genre, I guess. I try to compare what happened historically to what's happening contemporaneously. And there's always, as Mark Twain said, history doesn't always repeat itself, but it does rhyme. I do find that there are a lot of eerie similitudes between the past and the current day.
All right. Well, this is not one of my planned questions, but is there an analogy in the past to what's going on today? That must be your number one question you get on the radio. These seem like the end times politically, that it's all over once you cannot trust in the peaceful transfer of power, and once you cannot trust an election, that this experiment we have is over. I guess 2 parts. How true is that? And is there any instance in history which shows that you can have this kind of thing happen? And we continue on.
Yeah, 1876, Rutherford B. Hayes was the Republican nominee, the incumbent governor of Ohio. He lost in the Electoral College to Samuel Tilden, the incumbent governor of New York, the Democratic nominee. Samuel Tilden actually, not only did he win a plurality, he actually won a majority of the votes, the only person ever to win a majority of the votes and still lose in the presidential election. So to make this as condensed as short as possibly I can, essentially originally it looked like Hayes was going to lose the election. There was a committee set up. The committee essentially installed Hayes as the president. They made a deal. The Republicans had always been in favor of Reconstruction efforts in the South after the Civil War. They were known early on as the party of civil rights. Rutherford B. Hayes made a deal that in order for him to be installed in the presidency, first of all, he would not serve for re-election, but he would also agree that when he becomes president, he would take the troops out of the South, essentially. So the Democrats agreed to it. Rutherford B. Hayes becomes president. And by, a couple years later, Rutherford B. Hayes had a relatively non-eventful term and was actually relatively popular, and very few people kind of thought anything of it. But I think the analogy I always use in terms of the times generally is very similar to the 1890s, actually. So Grover Cleveland gets elected in 1884, serves a full term, loses re-election to Benjamin Harrison, even though Cleveland actually won in the Electoral College. Then by 1893, Cleveland comes back in, the only person ever to serve 2 non-consecutive presidential terms, and there's a depression, the Panic of 1893. Cleveland does almost nothing about it. He thinks essentially that the president's job should be as a quote unquote guardian president. In other words, Congress should take up. Congress in the state should be almost omnipotent. President should do very little. There were protests. There were protest people coming to Washington, marches in Washington saying, please, 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 Mr. President, do something about this depression. He did virtually nothing. So by 1896, there was a revolution within the Democratic Party, known as the Conservative Party. William Jennings Bryan, a former 2-term member of the House of Representatives from Nebraska and losing Senate candidate, goes up there, gives a speech talking about how America will not be crucified on the cross of gold, talks about how he supports, how he's opposed to the gold standard. He wants more munificent social services, basically the first liberal Democrat to run for president. He beats the Democratic establishment. Cleveland was so unpopular, he didn't run for president. As a result, Grover Cleveland does not even endorse him that year and endorses a third-party candidate, John M. Palmer, a 79-year-old senator from Illinois. Very similar to what's going on right now. In 2016, Trump, who had a divergence with the Republican Party on foreign intervention, on immigration, and on trade, garners a nomination. As a result, George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush, the only two former living presidents of the Republican Party, do not even endorse the Republican Party's nominee. In 2020, George W. Bush wrote in Condoleezza Rice, Secretary of State, for president. So it's very interesting, kind of the rupture within the party. But I tell you, if you look at what happened, William Jennings Bryan, obviously a different personality, but he changed the trajectory and the ideology of the Democratic Party, very similar to the way Donald Trump did in the Republican Party.
So you, having the benefit of the knowledge of history, are probably not as freaked out about the situation as I am.
No, I mean, I think that you do see this, and generally, I guess 2000 would be another example, when you had that dispute of those 36 days between Al Gore and George W. Bush, and then finally the Supreme Court, by ruling of 5-4, stopped the Florida recount, and George W. Bush became president. I mean, certainly there were many protests, but then, of course, eventually you had 9/11 in Afghanistan, and George W. Bush, at least for his first 2 years, stayed relatively popular. But I do think that there is kind of, honestly, if you look at historically, there is kind of a cycle. It's very cyclical, the American political system. We have experiences like, for example, you can go back to the Great Depression. In 1932, there was a lot of dissatisfaction by Herbert Hoover. By 1936, Franklin Roosevelt, running for re-election, only loses Maine and Vermont in the presidential election, wins over 60% of the vote. So you really saw that kind of transmogrification from people being unsettled with the political process to really, I think, supporting what was going on certainly by 1936. And another example would be certainly 1968. 1968, you had certainly the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr., the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, Eugene McCarthy's challenge about Lyndon Johnson, his opposition to the Vietnam War, winning 42.9% of the vote in the Democratic primary. Johnson drops out of the race. You have riots in Chicago when Hubert Humphrey, the Democratic establishment choice, lands up winning the nomination over Eugene McCarthy, even though McCarthy had won in the primaries. You have certainly the Vietnam War, the Tet Offensive. This was all going on in 1968. People wondered, what's going to happen next? What's going to happen next? But you know what? Is there a revolution? Will America be? No more. By 1972, Richard Nixon wins 49 states. 1976, Jimmy Carter comes in and wins pretty much the entire South except for the state of Virginia. So I think you do kind of have this, this shift from times that are very divisive, like right now, and then eventually you have an election where you have some sort of a blowout or some sort of a steady state, if you will.
All right. You mentioned the Gore thing as an example of something similar to what's going on now. But it wasn't similar at all. That was handled in a way that you're supposed to handle it. This is not. This is a completely other situation. They use the system to sort it out, whereas at least one side's trying to break the system this time.
Yeah, it's one part of one side. You have establishment Republicans who are essentially saying, let's accept the status quo. And then you have MAGA Republicans or Trump Republicans who are essentially saying, no, we won the last presidential election. But you're right. I guess my comparison to 2000 is there was so much dissatisfaction with those who thought that Al Gore had actually won Florida and thought that the election was stolen with them by the Supreme Court. There were many protests right around certainly the day when the Supreme Court made the decision. There were certainly protests when George W. Bush was sworn in as president. But you're right. I see what you mean. Essentially, in terms of 2000, Al Gore rather, he was in Tennessee and he gave a speech and he essentially said, "Well, I strongly disagree with the Supreme Court's decision." He said, "I accept it," and he did accept it, and that actually certainly increased his popularity. He went back to Tennessee. Probably could have garnered the party's nomination in 2004. He didn't. He decided not to run, but he certainly spoke and said, essentially, "I'm going to go back to Tennessee and mend some fences," because he lost his home state. And it's very similar in terms of what happened in 2020. There's certainly very many Donald Trump supporters who will not accept the presidential election. They would certainly say, well, look at Stacey Abrams in Georgia. Stacey Abrams didn't accept the election when she was running for governor against Brian Kemp. But there is certainly, there's certainly a revolution going on within the Republican Party. I think the question after Donald Trump is going to be this: will the Republican Party go back to the status quo ante, meaning the status quo before the current status quo, when the Republican Party, basically their ideology from Eisenhower winning elected to 52 all the way to essentially right around the 2016 time when Donald Trump took over? Or are they going to go to where Donald Trump is, and is the ideology going to essentially be an economic nationalist mega type of a party? It's a fascinating kind of all these epiphenomenons here.
So what do you think? Which of those are going to be the case? What's going to happen?
I think, well, first of all, let's ask the question: does Donald Trump run for president in 2024? And let's assume that he does not run. If he does not run, then there are going to be two bloodlines in the Republican Party. There are going to be establishment type Republicans that are going to say, essentially, they're going to try to kind of co-opt and hug Donald Trump's politics without necessarily trying to support him, like for example, saw us in the Virginia governor's race, for example, last time around. But also try to win over independents and try to win over somewhat the establishment the Republican Party. You're going to very interested to see who, for example, Mitch McConnell will endorse, if he endorses anybody in 2024. Then there's going to be somebody who's going to try to pick up the Donald Trump mantle, the tribune of the Donald Trump wing. Maybe Kristi Noem, for example, the mayor of South Dakota, is the one I keep thinking is potentially going to try to pick up that wing. Mike Pompeo, the former Secretary of State, is another one. Marsha Blackburn, senator from Tennessee. You're going to have a litany of Congress members, House members, who are going to say, essentially, I'm a Trump Republican. Ted Cruz, who had a bitter rivalry with him in 2016, but have since made amends, will probably run. Assuming if he wins re-election in Florida, which I don't think is necessarily a sure thing, then certainly I think Ron DeSantis is going to try it. But you're going to have this war between those who are true mega people, those who are kind of establishment people, and then there's going to be an anti-Trump wing, and that's probably going to be either Larry Hogan, the incumbent governor of Maryland, potentially Lynn Cheney, the congresswoman from Wyoming, who disassociated herself with Trump completely, maybe Adam Kinzinger, congressman from Illinois, who the only other member of the House of Representatives who is a Republican, who was on the House January 6th committee. So it's actually going to kind of be three bloodlines running against each other. Now, if Trump does run, then it's probably going to be Donald Trump, and there's going to be somebody who's going to say that they support Donald Trump's ideology, but they're not with Donald Trump, and potentially run to the right of Donald Trump by saying that Donald Trump supported certain mandates and Donald Trump should have done more to avert the shutdown of the country during COVID. And I think that's going to be the case that somebody to the right of Donald Trump will make, and then you'll certainly have the liberal, or the kind of what's left of kind of the Rockefeller Ford liberal to moderate wing as well.
My prediction on whether or not Trump runs it, I can't really. I guess if I have to predict, I'll say no, he won't. The only reason he would is because I feel it would be temporary protection from indictment. It'd be harder to do that with him as an actual candidate. But the chances of him losing are significant. Deep in his gut, he knows that, and there's one thing he can't take is losing. It'd be better for him to be the embittered guy on the sidelines than a total loser. That's my theory. Do you have a theory on that?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And I think that's why, for example, if you go back to 2000, he was thinking about winning as the Reform Party's nominee. He said that both parties were too extreme, And eventually, though, he said, well, the party is not unified. They said Pat Buchanan is an Adolf Hitler lover, Pat Buchanan, who ended up winning the Republican Party nomination. And he basically left the Reform Party. He's done this before in 2012. He seriously considered running for the nomination. Then he didn't. 2016, he actually put his toes in the water and he galvanized something that I don't think America really knew how much he was able to galvanize. My guess with Donald Trump, you're right. The one thing he does not want to be, and I completely concur on this, completely agree with it, is a loser. Now, it's better for him to go back in history and say, I won in 2016. I won states like Wisconsin that other Republicans weren't able to win. 2020, he'll say, I won 2020 as well, but they stole it from me. And then he'll say, well, in 2024, essentially, I'm going to take myself out of it and I'm going to be some sort of a kingmaker. But the last scenario he could possibly want, and there are polls showing that he's not the preponderant front runner to even win the nomination in 2024, is to first actually lose in the primaries to another Republican, showing he's no longer hegemonic over the Republican Party, or in the general election to lose decisively to a Democrat to the point that he cannot say that the election was purloined from him. So I agree with your supposition there.
You mentioned the Supreme Court a bit ago, yeah. And going back historically, is there a time when there was the lack of trust and confidence in the Supreme Court that we're starting to feel now with the whole Clarence Jenny Thomas thing, the whole Aileen Cannon thing, and then the Brett Kavanaugh in general, and conservative justices who were questioned about Roe during their hearing and said one thing and kind of acted another way. The confidence is waning. Has there been a time in the past when it has been like this?
Yeah, I think the 30s, certainly. Franklin Roosevelt gets elected in 1932, starts to institute with the Democratic Congress, the New Deal, his social welfare programs, and the conservative United States Supreme Court starts to strike many of his decisions down. So he gets reelected. He gets 1934. The party actually picks up seats in the House of Representatives, almost unprecedented. The Democratic Party, only 2 Republican governors in California and in Kansas actually were reelected that year in 1934. 1936, Franklin Roosevelt runs for reelection, only loses Maine and Vermont. And the Supreme Court continues to strike down New Deal programs. So FDR has this plan, and he has over 60% of the country supporting him. So you would think through that, they would also be supporting his plan. And the plan was for every justice over 70 years old, Franklin Roosevelt could appoint another justice. So essentially court packing. Now, there's nothing in the United States Constitution that says there has to be a certain number of justices. 9 is very much arbitrary. It could be 10, it could be 57, it could be 3. So Roosevelt makes this proposal, and there's some support toward the beginning, but eventually the American people start to view that Franklin Roosevelt is becoming too hegemonic. He's becoming too authoritarian. He's becoming magisterial. He's becoming dictatorial. And in 1938, the Democratic Party gets completely wiped out in the midterm elections. But that's probably the time I think is probably closest in terms of when you have a majority of the country supporting the president. But what did happen eventually, though, like the Wagner Act and some other acts, eventually the justices started right around the time when Roosevelt was talking about this court packing plan, which never passed, by the way. The justices did begin to accept some of Franklin Roosevelt's proposals. Sometimes there would be a few justices kind of in the middle, a stitch in time saves 9. And eventually, by 1940, it was kind of a non-issue when Franklin Roosevelt got reelected.
All right. We did get a comment here from William Toll. I'm sure a lot of people make that mistake. What would it take to abolish the Electoral College and gerrymandering? I'm going to skip the gerrymandering and go to Electoral College. Wasn't a large part of the purpose of the Electoral College to overcome kind of logistical situations back in the day that don't exist now? And doesn't the Electoral College take away, doesn't it make it unequal as far as individuals' votes counting? A person in a small state's going to have a little more clout than a person in a big state, right?
Yeah, I actually don't think it does give it. Let's go back. The intention of the Electoral College, essentially at the Constitutional Convention that summer of 1787 in Philadelphia, they agreed on some things, they disagreed on some others, and essentially, in terms of how electoral votes, how people would pick the president, they could not agree. Some wanted there to be a popular vote directly. Some wanted legislatures to choose. Some wanted the congressional delegations to choose. So essentially what they did is they gave the power to the states. So the states have the power to choose their electoral votes any way they choose. People think that, and it's a misnomer, that whoever wins that it's all about essentially whoever wins that state. So the person, if someone wins Arkansas by one vote, they have to win all their electoral votes. But that's all arbitrary. And it goes back to the first presidential election. The Democratic Republican Party, which is actually Elbridge Gerry's party, is Elbridge Gerry rather party as well, was trying to maximize their majority. So they made these laws in their states and said, why don't we give all of our electoral votes to whoever wins the popular vote? Now, there are two states, Maine and Nebraska, do it proportionally. And there is actually a proposal, John Cazza from California, the guy who invented the scratch-off lottery ticket, and his proposal is essentially, well, first of all, the Constitution, all it says is each state shall appoint in such a manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors. It says no way, how. So states have plenary authority to choose. And what this proposal is, in some states, a lot of states have already agreed to it, is essentially they agreed to award their electoral votes to whoever wins the national popular vote, but they would only do it once enough states requiring the 270 requisite electoral votes agreed to this proposal. So no state is going to do it unilaterally. Now, here's the issue with the Electoral College. If you look at it, it oppresses large states, certainly California, for example, and New York. Presidential candidates will go there, they'll parachute in, raise money, then they'll dispatch themselves to Iowa, Ohio, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, and campaign there. Same thing with small states, by the way. North Dakota, Wyoming, South Dakota, Idaho, and Utah and Alaska have not gone for a Democrat for president since LBJ in 1964. And very rarely are they contested elections, and that was a landslide. LBJ won 44 states that year. So what happens is those states are completely shut out of the electoral process, and all those states, by the way, are predominantly rural states. So as a result, the presidential candidate has no incentive to go to North Dakota, to go to South Dakota, and talking about what's going on essentially in the prairie, issues like the Farm Bill, for example. But they do have incentive to go to Ohio or Pennsylvania. So when George W. Bush in 2003, when there's a possibility, when Rick Santorum, a bunch of senators from Pennsylvania and Ohio come in and say, we need steel tariffs, Bush had been an unequivocal free trader, says, all right, I'm going to support steel tariffs because obviously that's something that's going to benefit folks in Ohio. But it really does oppress the small states. The other side, where states like Rhode Island, for example, never get any presidential candidates come to speak and they never get any attention. So you may make the argument, well, okay, let's say we didn't have let's say we went to a national popular vote. Would candidates still go to North Dakota and South Dakota? Well, probably not that much, but they would at least have a campaign office there because essentially a vote in North Dakota would be at least tantamount to a vote in Ohio. A vote in Marblehead, Massachusetts would be no different than a vote in Marblehead, Ohio versus a vote in Marblehead, Illinois versus a vote in Marblehead, Oregon or Marblehead, Wisconsin. So there would be campaign office. Just think of it, it would be like a big state election. Now you say in a state election, essentially, would candidates spend more time would they spend time in small enclaves like Peru? Probably not, but there would at least be an effort. There would at least be canvassing. There at least to try to get every single voter out there because it doesn't matter if they live in Peru, Massachusetts, or they live in Lowell, Massachusetts.
One thing I don't understand is why it matters to people if a presidential candidate goes to this state. Who cares? I don't care if he comes to my state. I care about how he will administer.
I get that, but I think that what it is, it's more you try to pander to a certain constituency. For example, go during a presidential campaign. The presidential candidates when they go to Iowa, for example, an issue like ethanol subsidies. Because Iowa is a swing state, also a primary state, candidates have to go there and kowtow to the people of Iowa about that issue.
I see.
Now, there are other issues. There are issues certainly going on with water rights, for example.
Okay.
Some states where it doesn't necessarily matter, and the presidential candidates, as a result, have no incentive. For example, when there was the BP oil spill, when it was in Alabama, there was no incentive because Alabama is a red state for any presidential candidate or incumbent president to spend time. But then when it goes right over the panhandle, when it comes to Florida, all of a sudden Florida is a quintessential swing state,
I
and
see.
then you have to spend time in Florida. Let's say that. We'll give one example. The fishing industry in New England gets very little attention nationally because the fishing industry is in New England, and Massachusetts, for example, the fishing industry issues with regulations. Why would an incumbent president want to spend any time dealing with that or listening to them when they could be listening about steel tariffs in Pennsylvania?
So you go to the state so you can micro pander.
Which is what politics is, yeah.
You go to micro pander. You talk to Massachusetts about fishing only in Massachusetts. You go there to do it because nobody else cares about Massachusetts stuff. So you have to go around and kiss the butt of each individual special interest. Whereas if you did it from home in a national way, you'd be talking about a lot of stuff people didn't care about. Couldn't you, though, pander from home with the technology we have? Couldn't you micro pander from some office somewhere? We're going to broadcast this stuff in Massachusetts. We're going to broadcast this stuff in this state. Couldn't you do that? Wouldn't that be cheaper and better? And wouldn't that be better for the electoral process because it would require less money?
Well, yeah, I guess also, remember, a lot of these people actually have day jobs, and usually they're not, when they're campaigning, if you're a governor of Florida, governor of Texas, or governor of California, you're not actually doing your day job if you're spending your time out campaigning for president. So that would actually allow them to do that. It is somewhat old-fashioned, that an antediluvian, if you will, you actually have presidential candidates having to actually go out there and actually give campaign speeches at a time when we actually have mass media, when all they have to do is go on social media and talk to people that way, as opposed to, it's amazing. Let's look at how much time during a presidential race they spend in Ohio and Florida pandering to very micro-targeting constituencies, or New Hampshire. New Hampshire is very small. It gets a lot of attention. North Dakota is very small. It gets zilch attention. Null set. Bumpkus. So you do have a point there, and it certainly is old-fashioned for a guy to actually come to a state and actually do the campaigning, when, of course, so much of this could just be done digitally and electronically. But, I mean, we are still in the age where people actually want to see a president. And obviously, when Air Force One touches down or a governor comes to that state, you know what they're getting. If a governor comes to a state, let's say he goes to the Upper Peninsula in Michigan, for example, very obscure area of Michigan, very large geographically, but does not have a lot of actual denizens. So a presidential candidate comes there, you know what? All the media gravitates there, the national media, but also the state media. And as a result, the first story on the news that day is the presidential candidate comes to this area, or the incumbent president comes to that area, and they get free media because they're doing that. And then everybody's focused on that person versus the other candidate, and potentially benefactors or donors are looking and they're hearing what they're saying, and they're saying, oh, he's coming to there. I'm going to give money. I'm going to support him. And it's kind of this snowball effect, if you will.
All right, one more question. I've experienced a weird thing with somebody I know, and I'm going to ask you how common it is and ask you about it. I know somebody very well who is a liberal, who's so liberal that they really despise Joe Biden.
Yep.
Just think Joe Biden is the worst thing, the worst enemy. So this liberal person, in order to punish centrists and Joe Biden, like centrists like Joe Biden, are actually in sometimes active and sometimes passive way supporting Trump, sharing these videos from young hip folks saying how great the years between 2016 and 2020 were. They hate Biden so much they are supporting Trump. What's going on there? And is this a common thing?
Yeah, it actually is. This is the point where Ralph Nader's bicycle rams into Pat Buchanan's Mercedes. How do you do? This is where right essentially meets left. And this is what the right does not understand. When they say liberal and they talk about, they talk about far left, they talk about the leftists, they talk about the far left. They're thinking Nancy Pelosi, they're thinking Joe Biden. If you actually talk to people on the far left, they view some of the people, they view Joe Biden, they view Nancy Pelosi, they view Chuck Schumer, sometimes Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, Al Gore. They view these people essentially as apostates. They view them as too centrist. They view them as essential accommodationists. Go back. That's why Joe Biden certainly did not do well with the cultural left when he ran for president. Bill Clinton was not their candidate in '92. It would have been someone like Tom Harkin, Jerry Brown, or potentially Ralph Nader, who did somewhat run in New Hampshire that year. So that's part of the reason, by the way, Ralph Nader did so well in 2000. There was a lot of dissatisfaction toward Bill Clinton, toward Al Gore, amongst the left wing of the party. They view the Democratic Party as corporatists, as sellouts. And part of this is some of it goes back to the Clinton era, when Bill Clinton, for example, supported NAFTA, supported welfare reform, tried to balance the budget. They wanted essentially more social programs. Then when Bill Clinton supported economic sanctions in Iraq, invaded Kosovo, for example, they were very much against that. They're very much anti. They're not militaristic. They're very much populist in terms of economic issues. On the Israel-Palestine issue, most of them are very critical of the Israeli government, whether it was Netanyahu or Bennett or the Likud government, and they don't understand why the Democratic Party does not question the policies of the Likud government. So that's why, essentially, they are so dissatisfied. And then Donald Trump comes in when he runs in 2016. He says, I'm anti-war. And he said to Jeb Bush, your brother started a war that killed 1 million people. And it's saying, oh my gosh, this guy's a Republican. This guy's actually somebody who we can actually support. And all of a sudden, they might hate him personally. They might hate him more than they hate Biden, but they hate centrist and center-left Democrats so much that they're willing to essentially accept some things, including Donald Trump's somewhat anti-war premise. It's fascinating that Donald Trump has changed the trajectory, and now all of a sudden, and on trade too, Donald Trump says NAFTA was a huge mistake. The far left, Bernie Sanders, he thinks NAFTA was a huge mistake as well. They agree on that. It's fascinating.
It is, but it seems to me, but to try to say that Biden and Trump are equal is nuts. I don't see how they can take one or two issues and say that they're sort of equal, because they're not. And it seems to me to be letting the tail wag the dog, cutting their nose off to spite their face. It's like, dude, if you don't support Biden, you're going to get Trump. And there are consequences for that you don't like, because he's going to appoint a bunch of judges that you're not going to like, and Roe is going to go away. To me, the Bernie people are essentially responsible for what's going on with Roe.
Well, although I do think Bernie himself has actually been a pretty ardent supporter of Joe Biden. It's not Bernie himself.
His supporters,
and some of those who are to the left of him. Some of it would be Tulsi Gabbard supporters. Tulsi Gabbard, who ran for president, remember the congresswoman from Hawaii, talked about the military-industrial complex. Many of them said they would support the Green Party nominee, Howie Hawkins, over Joe Biden, because they are so dissatisfied with the establishment of the party. And certainly, it reminds me again in 2000. People would say on the left, Michael Moore, Ralph Nader would say there's not a dime's worth of difference, essentially, I'm paraphrasing, between Al Gore and George W. Bush. So there were these bumper stickers that were made that said it's about the Supreme Court. Meaning, essentially, you may think Al Gore is a corporatist, you may think everything bad, you may think he's a military, you think he's a hawk, everything else. But when it comes down to it, someone's going to nominate Supreme Court justices, and would you rather have George W. Bush do it or Al Gore do it? But there are some people who are rather be ideologically pure than they would actually compromise and kind of deal with Joe Biden. That is interesting.
Ideological purity doesn't make sense. You have to have power first, and then you can legislate. If you are a purist, you're going to lose. If you're not going to support somebody that can win, you're going to lose it all.
Unless
you're like the dog who saw his reflection and thought, oh, there's another bone. I'm going to try to get that bone, and he's got no bones at all.
Well, the
story, right?
Yeah, most of the ones that are actually elected that are on the far left or the far right represent districts that are so gerrymandered, so conservative, or so liberal that the only way they're going to lose is in a primary. Now, but they represent obviously very small constituencies in the United States. If you try to run nationally and in a general election as somebody who's uncompromising, ideologically intransigent, chances are you're going to lose. Perfect example, a state like Massachusetts, for example. They will elect Republican governors, going back to John Volpe, going back to Frank Sargent, Channing Cox, Bill Weld, Paul Cellucci. But they all run essentially as someone who's going to be a check on the other party, and it's going to be somewhat progressive, and is not going to essentially do elephantine changes and they try to make the case that, well, the other party's got overwhelming majorities in the other branches, so what can I do? So Mitt Romney gets elected in 2002 on that platform, saying he's going to be a progressive type of a guy. His second 2 years in office, as he starts running for president, he has to move himself further to the right to run for president. So he becomes an outspoken advocate against gay marriage. He changes his views on abortion. He gets out of the regional greenhouse gas initiative. So what happens? Well, Mitt Romney becomes almost an ideological purist on conservatism. So his job approval goes from 60% to 34%. And Kerry Healy, running to succeed him for governor, is trying to run as somewhat of a moderate, but people are now seeing Mitt Romney as somebody who's a national Republican, and Kerry Healy loses by 21 points. So there is certainly, it benefited Mitt Romney, but it's something that certainly did not benefit the Republican Party of Massachusetts. Politics is about knowing where your constituents are, and it's about putting yourself, no matter what the constituency is, whether it's San Francisco or Provo, Utah, putting yourself in the mainstream and your opponent in the extreme, no matter what the constituency is.
And you are interesting. One question. We're with Rich Rubino, by the way, author of 5 books. We'll run through the 5 books are again. They're not all serious, by the way. Some of them are funny.
Oh, absolutely.
I have one more question. Did you see, I'm sure you saw the Beto O'Rourke, Greg Abbott debate?
Oh, yeah. Yes.
A couple questions regarding that, or actually one observation. It seemed to me the debate was run very well. And why can't national debates run that well? But 2, Beto O'Rourke, very practiced, very good, did a great job, but does he have a shot at all in Texas?
The winds are against him. So Beto O'Rourke came out of nowhere. He was a city councilman, member of the House of Representatives, ran for Senate against Ted Cruz, and really was able to galvanize support in all regions of the state. That was part of his appeal, is he was able to go to a place like Midland or the Permian Basin, Odessa, and actually get support by trying to talk about common ground that both sides essentially have. So he came close, ran against Ted Cruz, and landed up barely losing. Then I think he didn't show political dexterity, ran for president, and had to move far to the left by saying that, he says in the debate, hell yes, I'll take away your AK-47s, for example, meaning that not only would he ban them, he would actually take away them from people who actually own them. Now, in his last debate, he said essentially no. If you listen to him, he said, I'm not going to do that. He said, but he dodged it a little bit. They didn't ask him specifically. They asked him specifically, what does he support? And he says, I'm not going to do that, but I do think we should bring the age limit for guns from 18 to 21, and that's something we can do. But he's a very attractive candidate in many respects in a state like Texas. But, Texas has not had, this is back to 1994 when Ann Richards was governor and lost to George W. Bush. They have had a string of Republicans in pretty much every solitary constitutional office. In all constitutional offices, agriculture secretary, for example, is not nominated, supported by the governor. They're nominated, they're elected independently or autonomously. So you're actually voting for the agriculture commissioner. You're voting for 13 other seats. So it's very hard, and it's basically a Republican year. But Greg Abbott has job approval right around 50%. So I would say the odds are probably against him. And also he's got kind of the stigma of being a perennial candidate because he's done it 3 times now. But he's probably the most attractive candidate, probably more so than Matthew McConaughey in that respect, who considered running as well for the governorship of Texas in a year where Democrats theoretically should not win. But as I say, and I'll say one thing, the Ann Richards, George W. Bush race, Ann Richards on election day had a 60% personal approval rating. So people liked Ann Richards, but they still voted for George W. Bush because the state wanted a Republican, even though they liked her. I think it's very similar. Beto O'Rourke, he's very likable, but the state is still Republican. It could become less and less that in the next couple of elections, but it's still a predominantly, barely Republican state.
Is related to that. Is Greg Abbott doing a terrible job? I Beto O'Rourke painted a terrible picture, but what's the reality?
Like everything else, it's nuanced. Like everything else in the world and in politics, I don't know. He's certainly he's been generally a very conservative Republican governor in the line of George W. somewhat to the right of George W. Bush and Rick Perry, I think, on the issues of immigration and the issues of gun control. He's certainly been somewhat to the right of both of them. He did have actually a primary challenge from some people. There were some people, Alan West, for example, the former congresswoman from Florida who think he's actually been too liberal or too accommodationist. This is that, far right again. But my guess is he's probably going to eke out a reelection bid, and then probably as soon as he gets reelected, Texas, Texas is one of those states where you do very little. The legislature meets for like 90 days every 2 years. So he's probably going to start running for president as soon as he gets reelected. If he doesn't get reelected, and I do think there's a chance of that, then I think Beto O'Rourke, immediately people are talking about him as a potential vice presidential nominee or presidential nominee. He's a very galvanizing figure, and he's very charismatic. That's why he was able to make inroads when he ran in 2018 in places where Democrats really, generally, the contemporaneous Democratic Party really have no business winning, but he was able to do that.
So it's Rich Rubino, commenter and author, political books, and they're certainly not all serious. Actually, I can see, are any of them serious? Like the Political Bible, Humorous Quotations. Why don't you pick one and talk about it? Okay,
here's one. So Everett Dirksen, if you remember, he used to be Senate Minority Leader from Illinois.
I mean, pick one of the books and talk about that.
Oh,
I guess talk about the Political Bible.
Okay.
What is the Political Bible?
There are a couple. The first was the Political Bible of little-known facts in American politics, things that essentially people do not know. For example, under the Articles of Confederation, they had this was the Constitution prior to the Constitution. Very conservative document. States had pretty much autonomy on everything. Federal government had very little power, but they had an office of president called the Office of Congress Assembled, and they nominated one of their own, John Hanson, who became president, who became the president of the Congress Assembled. And as a result, he served for 1 year. His ancestors believe he should be considered the first president because he was the president of the Congress Assembled. So that's essentially one thing that I think is interesting. I'll give you another interesting one from the Humorous Quotations book. This I find fascinating. Everett Dirksen, he was Minority Leader from Illinois. He's the one who said that his he has unbending principles. The chief of which is to be flexible at all times. He had this rivalry with LBJ, and LBJ had a phone in the car. This was 1965. He had a phone in the car, and LBJ is talking to him. And finally, Everett Dirksen says at the end of the conversation, because he always tried to one up him, he says, "By the way, Mr. President, I'm talking to you on my car phone as well right now." LBJ looks down, he deadpans, "Oh, excuse me, yeah, but my other line is ringing." And one more with him.
All right.
He was when he was on an airplane, and someone said, "I love this quote you once supposedly said, $1 billion here, $1 billion there, and pretty soon you're talking about real money." Dirksen deadpans, "Oh no, son, I never said that. Just such a darn good quote, I never bothered to deny it."
There's a million in there. You have 5 books. Look them up. Rich Rubino, Rubino, and you know so much. We didn't even get. Actually, we got to very few of the questions that I had prepared. So we need to do this again. And also something that might be fun if you're into it is, in addition to doing things like we have done today, take a guy like LBJ.
Yes.
He's super interesting to me.
Me too.
And really spend a half an hour doing a bio on LBJ.
Let's do it.
Because you're the guy that knows all about him. He is a pretty intense dude, and a lot of people, especially me, know very little about him, and I'd like to know more. So thank you.
I'd love to do that.
All right, let's book something right away. Rich Rubino, Rubino. Everyone, do what you know you need to do. Share this, comment on it, do everything that you're supposed to do to help me, which helps Rich, and we all win.
Reciprocity.
Thank you very much, Rich. I'm not going away, but we'll be not live in about 4 seconds.